unmuted.
I did. Oh, I did. That one was on me. I did have it on mute. Here I was blaming Scotty. That's what I get. Okay. This one only took 3 minutes, so now we can start. All right, well, we have a lot to talk about today, and we've already wasted 3 minutes and 30 seconds because of my incompetence. So let's jump right in. If you have your Bibles, let's go ahead and turn to 1 Timothy chapter 2. It'll be on the screen some, but it's going to help you to go ahead and have it open so you can be reading along and maybe looking backward and forward and whatnot. This morning what we're going to do is walk through the text together, and we're going to go just about word by word, phrase by phrase, and question kind of everything. And what I encourage you to do in this study as we read and explore this topic is to have an open mind. Not that anything that we say really is going to be new. You know, you're not going to hear anything different. But how we approach every text should be with an open mind, right? Like, we want to know what the Bible says. And so you may already know some things about the Bible, of course. But when we read this text, it's nice to try as best we can to read it fresh. What is the Bible saying to us? So I try to do that every time I do a class, just so that I don't basically just give you all of Nate's thoughts. I give you as much as what I can from the Bible. So what we'll do is we're going to try to question everything. We'll present some responses, and then you do with all these words what you will. And I should preface by noting that this is not a class. We'll be in chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. This is not a class on women's roles necessarily. Like, we're not exploring the whole Bible on what does the Bible say about the role of women. But we're just trying to determine what Paul is writing to Timothy and the church in Ephesus. And then, of course, there's going to be some obvious applications as we go. So, let's read this together. Now, as we read this, look, I've been diving into some different stuff so I can really get an idea of what the other interpretations are and kind of what we're working against. And so this morning, as we read this first time, and then we're going to go through it, I'm going to give you maybe what you'll hear from the other side of the spectrum here. So for just a little bit, call me Kate Kidwell, not Nate Kidwell. This is not my opinion, but I will give you the opinion of the other side, Kate Kidwell. Okay, here we go, verse 11. A woman, now pause. This could be wives. Okay, you're gonna see how annoying and repetitive this is the more I do this. This could be wives we're talking about, not just women. And if this is wives, then we're talking about husbands and wives, and this isn't a command for all women. So there's one argument. All right, a woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. Now, there's the only command so far that we're going to get in the whole text. The emphasis here really is that women should just be learning. All right? A woman must quietly receive instruction. Now look, quietly is really a mistranslation, or if yours says silent, it's really a mistranslation. It should be peaceable or peaceful. He says in verse 12, but I do not allow a woman. Okay, now pause again. I really think that we misunderstand if we believe that this is Paul speaking universally with apostolic authority. This really is just his opinion. That's why he says, I do not want you to do this. It really should be, I do not permit for now. And so really this is just a mistranslation. Okay, I do not allow or permit a woman to teach. Now look, Paul really is only talking about false teaching or false doctrine. The whole letter actually is really only talking about false doctrine. You know, women can teach if they're educated. That's why they've got to learn, verse 11. And then they'll teach things that are true. Okay. It says, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority. Now look, exercise authority, this is really a mistranslation here. Really, it should be domineer over men or even murder or incite violence. And we'll get there when we get there. So women can't teach in a domineering fashion or find herself as dominant over a man, since no gender is supposed to be dominant over the other anyways. And so you can't say, women can't just say, I'm going to be a leader in the church. Because you can't just assume that, okay? So that's what it's saying. You can't dominate over someone. And really, there's a lot of history that shows a bunch of misogynists changing the translation to make it say what we want it to say. If you just came in, this is Kate Kidwell speaking, and he's a liberal scholar, and it's not Nate Kidwell. Wanted to preface. Okay. But I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Now remember, we're talking about husbands here, not just men. This is only about marriage. Verse 13. For it was Adam who was created first, and then Eve. Well, this is just combating some bad teaching from the temple of Artemis, and it's just correcting what some women were doing in Ephesus, domineering over men. And really, this is just establishing equality. Verse 14. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. These are not analogies for male and female. They're analogies for the educated and the uneducated. Women were trying to teach, but were being led into deception because they know less. And so Adam knew more than Eve since he got the instruction firsthand, right? And so as a result, Eve was weaker, and this led her into deception. And so we just shouldn't let people teach who are uneducated, who don't know their doctrine really well. And then verse 15. But women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. And so really what this verse is talking about is women, when they were having a child, would call out to Artemis and say, Artemis, please save me. I don't want to die in this childbearing. And so what Paul really is saying is, hey, Christian women, instead of calling out to Artemis, call out to God, and God will save you. Okay. Now, that was just, back to Nate Kidwell now. That was just a bunch of baloney. Okay, there's a bunch of stuff that we're going to talk about and go through. But as you can see, these scholars will kind of pick apart every word and every phrase that is available, and they're going to say it's all in light of the culture and of false teaching and stuff. And so we're going to walk through this text together, and we're going to address as many of these arguments as we can and get into the nitty-gritty a little bit. And we're going to talk about why they think they're right, and then explain what Paul is actually saying. Now, before you think, like, Nate, why are we going to get into all these little things? A lot of that stuff made no sense that you just said. There's no point. Like, this doesn't matter, okay? This text is obvious. Why do we care what everybody else thinks? I think you need to understand that this is a real issue even in the Church of Christ. It's not an issue at Dalraida now. Like, we know what we believe, and we're going to go through that here in a minute. But you can even look around Montgomery's, we'll call it religious scene, and see that there are some differing opinions on this, of course. And there are churches of Christ near to us who are already beginning to kind of make concessions with this passage. This is not a regional issue of, well, out west, they do this. But here, there are people who are struggling with this text. So let me just, a couple of examples. Let me tell you, all I did was look up churches of Christ who use women leadership. And I got a list of like 40 or 50 with different sources. And I found a couple who have written up, like, this is what we believe and whatnot. So this is actually, Pepperdine University published this work about the Highland Church of Christ in Abilene, Texas. And this guy, John T. Willis, he writes about why the Highland Church of Christ changed their stance. And this is what he says. He basically goes through all of these things from verses 8 through 15. So he says, men lift up holy hands when they pray. Remember verse 8. Women dress modestly and decently in suitable clothing. Women don't have their hair braided. Women don't have to wear gold and pearls or expensive clothing. Women are to do good works. Women are to learn in silence, not teach or have authority over man. They'll be safe through childbearing. And so he references all of these kind of bullet points from verses 8 through 15, and then says this, well, the following types of questions begin to be raised if all of those things are true. Must we insist that all men lift up holy hands when they pray? Okay, we'll pause. Didn't we talk about that last week? And we got into some of the nitty-gritty to figure out, well, that's not really exactly what that's saying, right? Okay. Must we insist that all men lift up holy hands when they pray? Must women dress modestly and decently in suitable clothing only in public assemblies? Must women not have their hair braided? Must women not wear gold, pearls, or expensive clothes? Must women do good works, but not men? And so he's picking at all these questions saying, well, this is just limited to here? Well, what about this? And taking a couple of things, some liberties here, okay? Now, I don't want to address this yet because we'll address it as we get through the text. There's another church in Franklin, Tennessee. It's getting closer to home, right? And they wrote this whole long statement about their beliefs on this, about women in ministry and in leadership. And they cited a number of Church of Christ scholars assist and justify their new interpretation here. and they use a lot of the same arguments that I just gave you earlier. They say, this isn't supposed to be a universal statement, because look at verse 8 about men lifting holy hands. We don't apply that universally, right? And what about this and this and this? Well, they say, well, silent is really an attitude. It's not like a volume thing, and they quote a bunch of Old Testament passages. They discount verse 15 by saying, well, this can't be about women having children because biology and whatnot. And so Paul's got to have something else in mind, which means he's got to have something else in mind for verses 11 through 12. Okay, and then they also says, well, over a man really should be over a husband. Now, this is a Church of Christ in Franklin, Tennessee, who is writing this. And so what I'm trying to get across to you, and if you want, in my notes, which are you're welcome to get, I have links to those things and several other things if you want to read those in your own time. What I'm getting at is there are churches who call themselves the Church of Christ from Massachusetts to California to Georgia and all in between, really, that are saying these things. The whole kind of ridiculous beginning I gave you of well, this and this and this, they're saying those exact things. And so this is not let's just get into some stuff that we never need to really know or talk about. We have people who we would call, or have called, maybe in the past, brothers and sisters, who now have changed their mind on this verse because of some scholarship that's biased and not really great. And these are not bad or evil people. They're just wrong. And so we need to know how to combat this teaching. Okay, now let's actually get into the text. I just want to make sure we understand this is a real thing that we're getting into. Now, first thing we need to understand is that for anyone reading this text, trying to say it's cultural, and that Paul doesn't really mean what he's saying, the burden of proof lies on that person. The burden of proof lies on the person who says, well, Paul doesn't really mean what he's literally saying here, right? Well, why? Because that's what Paul says. So you're going to have to prove to anyone who reads this text that that's not what Paul means. And you're going to have to show some really good evidence to make that clear that Paul's not meaning something else. Now, is it possible? Is it possible that, Paul could mean something a little bit different than how we first read it? Sure. Look at verse 8. He requires men to lift holy hands. When you first read that, you might think, well, I guess we got to lift holy hands when we pray. But when you really study it, you see that's not really what he's talking about. So it's possible. Now, is it possible here? That's what we're going to study. The answer is no for future reference. All right, let's talk about context. While this passage does not immediately say, also women just in this place, we do need to know that there is some kind of certain setting in mind. And since we assume, with a very educated assumption, I should add, that verses 8 through 10 is kind of in the when Christians gather context, in verse 8 it says, in every place. And Paul is describing here when Christians are gathered, and I think he might even be relating it to John 4, verses 20 through 24, kind of in a way of Christians are about to be able to gather everywhere. It doesn't matter where you worship, on this mount or that mount, right? So he's saying in every place when men lift their hands. So anytime the Christians are gathered together. So we had this kind of public assembly Christians gathering setting in verses 8 through 10. And then now Paul is describing look in verse 10, what good works are not. He's saying women should be doing good works, and that's what they should adorn themselves in. Now we get into verse 11, and it connects the thought. So it seems that we're talking about the context of worship and Christian gatherings in this text. Now, verses 11 through 12. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. Okay? You read my notes, so that's what I'm about to get to. So the word actually can mean both. It's a word that can really just be woman or women, or it could be wives. So how are we supposed to tell? Context. So you look at all the stuff around it, and you say, well, what do we think this is supposed to mean here? Now, if it's women, then Paul is talking about the roles of each gender and their roles in teaching and having authority. Now, if it's wives, then it means that we're talking about a wife not domineering or having authority over her husband. And so, what are we talking about here? Well, the argument for wives can be, well, it can mean both. And actually the word for man can also mean both. And some people are going to say, well, Paul actually, pretty much every time he's talking about men and women, he's really talking about husbands and wives. And then they might also say, well, because verse 11 is singular. I don't know if you caught that, but it was plural in verses 9 and 10. This is how women should dress. Now, verse 11, let a woman learn. So it switches. And they say, well, because it's singular now instead of plural, really we're switching what we mean from all women to just wives. Okay, so let's talk about why not? Like, why would that not be the case? Why do we believe that this is women? Well, there's a really obvious one. Every time Paul uses this word, he doesn't always refer to wives. Now, I've got some verses here on the screen in 1 Corinthians 7:34, chapter 11, verse 12, and in Galatians 4:4, he's talking about a woman. And then in the context, verses 8 through 10, what are we talking about? Men and women, the genders, okay? And so all of this instruction makes a lot more sense when it's understood in the light of Christians gathering together and not just the family context, like wives and husbands, right? And then regarding the whole singular, it was women and now it's just let a woman teach, there's no grammar stuff in there that's like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So there's nothing that would cause one to say, well, this must be someone different because we switched to a woman, so it must be wives now, okay? And so what he's doing, and we'll get there hopefully in a minute, but what he's doing is he's relating that a woman to Eve, and we're going to see that when he gets into verse 13. But it's not a good argument. And so because this is about women, not wives, we can see that this isn't a marriage issue. It's a matter of gender that Paul's discussing. Okay, now let's talk about education just for a second. This is not some new command that women should now be taught. It's not like also women now you can start being taught. Women have been taught in the public assemblies. They've been able to go to synagogues and stuff where they can hear the reading of the Old Testament. They can hear the reading of Scripture. They've been learning in the church. And Paul says, this is not Paul saying, I know women aren't learning and now they should be learning. That's not what he's saying. And so some people are going to read this verse with the belief that it's only uneducated women who can't teach, but instead to let women learn before teaching. Only educated women can teach. And we'll get to that issue a little bit later, but this command here is without any kind of qualification or specification. It's not let the uneducated woman learn, it's just let a woman learn. And so this is just instruction for when Christians gather. And also, there's kind of this assumption that women just know significantly less than men in this time, and that's not generally the case. So quickly, you've got some really, really smart, educated, we shouldn't say smart. You've got some really educated men, and there's just a tiny percentage of women in this really educated category. And then the rest kind of fall over here into somewhat to not really educated at all category. And this is not very different between men and women. They're kind of all on the same field over here of not super educated. And so this is not saying, and also Paul went from house to house already in Ephesus. He talks about this in Acts chapter 20, that he's already taught the whole council to multiple different places with both men and women in it. So really they kind of all have the same level of biblical education to an extent anyways. And so this isn't saying women just know less here in Ephesus either. Paul isn't saying that women just need to become educated from men before teaching. Paul's talking about the roles of each gender. And this would be especially relevant if we're talking about there's a bunch of women who are false teachers and they're going around teaching things. And so really he's just saying women need to be educated before. This is a common, you might hear this or read this sometimes, there's a big deal in the Temple of Artemis. And so women are teaching a bunch of stuff because that's a women only thing. Fun fact, it's not a women only thing. And scholars don't really tend to cite their sources when they say that, or if they do, they're not very good sources. And so we're not talking about just women are false teachers running around teaching all these false things because the Temple of Artemis. And so Paul is saying they should learn first. Actually, the only false teachers Paul has referenced so far have been men. I don't know if you noticed, but in chapter 1, verse 20, you got Hymenaeus and Alexander, right? And then in Acts 19, he says men are going to come and be wolves. He's just been talking about a bunch of men who are false teachers. So this isn't well, women are just teaching false, and then we got to make sure they're educated. It's not what we're talking about. All right, let's talk about the word quietness or quietly. There's a couple options here, and this actually is pretty interesting, I think. I think the most popular view, not really in the church, but elsewhere, is that we're talking about a humble or peaceful demeanor. Now, it can be used that way. I've got these verses on the screen where you would look at that text and say, okay, well, we're obviously talking about not actual, like, audible silence, like I'm not going to make any noise, but just that I'm living a quiet life, like 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, where we just read a couple weeks ago. And so this wouldn't be just like impossible. But if you're going to say that it's complete audible silence here, then what's your argument? All right, well, one, it can be used that way too. Like, that's totally possible. Two, a general principle, and we already talked about this, when you're trying to figure out, like, should a word be this or that, you just look around it. Then you just look at what's around it and say, what fits best? Because that's really what's most important when determining the meaning of the words, right? And so the immediate context is talking about teaching when Christians have gathered, which kind of implies silence. Now, if you're like me, reading this and hearing all these things kind of for the first time, you might immediately think, well, he literally just used this word, quiet, to mean kind of peaceable in chapter 2, verse 2. So does that not fall in your whole context thing? Like, is that not close enough for us to assume the same meaning? Well, I would say the reason that we know that chapter 2, verse 2 is talking about Christians should live tranquil and, they should be praying for their kings and governing authorities so that they can live tranquil and quiet lives, meaning peaceable, because you have words around it like tranquil, godly, and dignified in reference to how Christians should desire to live their lives. What words do you have around this in verse 11 and 12? Well, you've got, actually, let's just compare verses 11 and 12. I have these little arrows on the screen. In verse 11, we're talking about quietness and submission. In verse 12, we're talking about teaching and having authority. And the two kind of pair, right? When we're talking about quietness, we're talking about not teaching. And when we're talking about submission, we're talking about not having authority, right? And so they kind of pair really nicely if you read it that way. So because of these things, I think Paul is talking about audible silence. And ultimately, you can say the whole peaceable thing if you want. What it still implies or means is that women are in the role of receiving instruction. And there's still submission there. And so I do think it's important for us to say that it's audible silence that we're talking about. Now, what is the application of women being silent or quiet? It's easy to say, all right, women should be quiet, and then move on. But there might be some hiccups if we do that. Now, do we mean complete silence? Okay, do we mean like no noise at all? Well, if so, women will be hindered from singing, right? Well, that's a command. And singing includes teaching and admonishing one another in songs and hymns and spiritual songs, Colossians 3:16. So that'd be a biblical contradiction, considering we're all commanded to sing as a body together. Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16. And some, like religious traditions, some people out there will apply this extremely literally. They'll say, all right, women can't sing because this verse says, don't make any noise. Well, you're disobeying. And so this can't mean utter, complete silence, right? And I thought about this and like, what would this look like to me? I thought about, when I was 5, 6 years old, when my mom looked at me and said, Nate, quit talking. Was I supposed to be like, actually, Mom, like you can't be talking here because we're in the church. I, a 6-year-old boy, can't. No. Okay, we're not talking about utter silence here, like whispers or instructing or disciplining children. That would be a bit extreme, right? Maybe an abuse of the text. So what is another option? Well, in Acts chapter 21, verse 40, it says that Paul waves his hands to the crowd who was there, and the crowd was silent. There was a great hush because he was waving for their attention. But then, in chapter 22, verse 2, so it is kind of like straight after, it says, Paul looked at the crowd and addressed them, and they became even more quiet. And there's our word that we've already used here. So they were already audibly quiet in chapter 21. It says that there was a great hush, a silence. Well, can you be in complete silence and then become even more silent? No, that doesn't really make sense, right? And so there's got to be some kind of, we're talking about quietness, And then like in Acts, it's like they were quiet. But then Paul started talking, they were even more quiet because they wanted to listen so badly. You see what I'm saying? We're not talking about like no noise at all. So based on Paul's context, it seems that the silence that's being referenced is not that women are forbidden from making any audible noise at all when Christians come together and there's teaching happening. So what is Paul saying? Well, I think in verse 12, you get an elaboration of verse 11, where Paul's saying, by entirely submitting to both sound teaching, relevant in this Ephesian context, you do have some false teaching coming around. Paul's already talked about it. When you submit to sound teaching and to man, the God-designed model, which we'll get to also in a second, thereby you're not taking authority, you're submitting to that, then women are to remain quiet and not teach. And so I think there's your application, is there are women who are to be in the receiving role of this instruction. Quiet. Okay, verse 12. But I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority. Now, what does Paul mean by I don't allow? Now, we kind of talked about this last week, in that just because Paul says I do not allow doesn't mean that he's saying like this can never happen. So Paul's giving some advice to the church, but he's also giving a command to the church in Ephesus because of what's happening. It's not like just because Paul is giving advice, it doesn't mean it's a command either, right? And so there's some scholars who's really going to stick on this and say, anytime Paul says this, he's got to have like an all around it or something to show it's for everybody. But I listed, I don't know how many verses, but a lot of verses on the screen for you. Oh, did I? Oh, this slide. I had to do a couple takes here. I was running out of space. I listed a bunch of verses on the screen for you where Paul doesn't use this whole, well, this is for everybody or for all people. He just says, like Romans 12, verse 1, I appeal to you or urge you, brethren, to live as a living sacrifice. Well, that's not just for Rome, right? It's for everybody. And so there's a bunch of examples of that. We're not just talking about Paul just giving one command. This is Paul commanding everyone. Ephesus was having a problem with it, though. Okay, to teach. I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority. Now, someone's going to say that this is just because of this false teaching or doctrine that's kind of being tossed around in Ephesus. Once people are more educated, women specifically, then they can teach. And this belief is basically going to say, we got to read the whole letter in light of false teaching. And everything's going to relate to it, including this. Well, that's not true. In verse 8, are you telling me that people were teaching men actually should be lifting impure, unholy hands? And so Paul's just combating that. No. Are you telling me in verses 9 and 10 that people are teaching you should actually dress immodestly? No. In chapter 3, when it gets to elders and deacons, are you telling me people are saying, actually, elders should have a bunch of wives, and it doesn't matter how they raise their kids, and they actually can have quick tempers? No. Paul's not combating false teaching in every single thing he does, and it's consistent here. So Paul does seem to be combating some cultural influence. We talked about that, women, and all the false teaching that's happening here in Ephesus. But in certain parts of the letter, and even a little bit including this one. But it's not such a dominant theme that we can't just say, like, this is actually applicable to everyone. So, exercise authority over a man. Now, this one, we probably won't spend much time on this one. You can read my notes if you'd like. There's 3 different ways that this word is weird. It's the only time it shows up in the whole Bible. It's only used 8 times before the year 312. And so it's weird to translate, okay? Now, it could be exercise authority. It could be assume authority. It could be to dominate or get one's way with. It could, and I said this earlier, it could be like murder and stuff. That one's like we're not going to address that one. But that would be a wild way to interpret the text, though, if it was murder. If it's assume authority, then you're talking about women like, all right, I'm in charge now. I'm taking the authority. And if you're talking about dominating, you're saying like all women are dominating over men. We have a lot of reasons to believe that this is not why it's translated and that we actually have the right one, that it is supposed to be exercise authority, mostly with a whole bunch of, several uses in from church fathers and stuff, and how it was kind of at least interpreted. And that's beside the point. You can look at my notes if you want. Just trust me on this one if you'd like. Exercise authority is pretty right, okay? Well, there's a bunch of options here. This one is the best in the context. It's the best, most supported, and whatnot. All right, let's get into verse 13 and 14. He says, for it was Adam who was created and then Eve. It was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Now let's first ask this question. Are women more easily deceived? You may have heard this kind of explanation from this passage, and it is such a bad teaching. And not only is it not what Paul is saying, but it's harmful to the church and for our fellowship today if that's taught. Paul is not at all devaluing women, but instead he is laying out God's designed order where each gender has roles that they are to fulfill. And when it comes to church leadership and teaching, it's for males. But that's not because women are more easily deceived. And so what's Paul getting at in this text? Well, first of all, he gives this teaching, verses 11 through 12, and then he grounds it in creation, verses 13 and 14. He's thinking about Genesis chapters 2 and 3. And so he grounds this in nature and design and references the fall. And so this text specifically, or especially, lifts Paul's command above the whole opinion thing and into this is how it's always been. This is how God wants it to be. You have Adam and Eve contrasted from each other. It's about the difference between man and woman, not education of Eve and being uninformed and all that stuff. What we have is Eve representing all women. Now, I referenced this earlier, but you see how in verses like 9 and 10, you've got, all women are to dress this way. In verse 11, it becomes singular, let a woman learn. I think it's because he's connecting that text to what we get here with Adam and Eve, the singular woman, Eve. Because Eve is the prototype woman. She represents all women, just like Adam often represents all men. And so what we're doing is we're comparing a fundamental difference between genders. And this is defending this previous idea. Paul's not teaching something that's found nowhere else in Scripture, like women are more easily deceived. That's nowhere else in the Scripture. In fact, there are actually many women who were able to see some stuff that men couldn't. And men were deceived and the women weren't. There's a bunch of examples of that. So the passage says that Eve was deceived. Not that Eve is more easily deceived, just like all other women. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3, Eve is actually used as an example to show the potential of any Christian to be deceived. So Paul is talking about the imbalance of authority that God has designed. Adam was made first, Eve was second. Adam was not deceived, Eve was. And this is why God gives authority to man, according to Paul. Now, some scholars are going to say something like, well, now you're just supporting the fall. Now you're just basking in the sin of the fall instead of trying to reverse it, which makes no sense. Like, what are we talking about here? And that sounds really cool to think like, yeah, reversing the fall, that is what, yeah. But it kind of makes no sense because as long as mankind still dies and men still have to work hard and women still have pain and childbearing, the roles continue. The roles that were started from the beginning. Remember the curse? The curse of Eve, of humanity. When Eve brought sin into the world and God said, well, this is how it's going to be from here on out. You're going to die. Men are going to have to work hard. Women are going to have pain and childbearing. As long as those things are still true, these gender roles hold true because God has made it this way, not just us. So Paul grounds his teaching, verses 11 through 12, in Genesis chapters 2 and 3 here, verses 13 and 14. And this makes them transcultural, universal. It's for everyone in the church. Well, really, everyone in the world, but we're talking about the church. So let's get to verse 15. What in the world does this mean? Now, we've got 9 minutes, and so I'll try to go as fast as I can through some of this. He says, but women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in love and sanctity with self-restraint. I should preface, I do believe, and someone could correct me if I'm wrong here, I do believe that women, correct me if I'm wrong here, that first women, that's supposed to be singular, right? Is it supposed to be like she? I really just assumed you had the text up. Never mind. All right. Well, yes? You said yes? Thank you. Okay. So New American Standard kind of goofed this one a little bit, I think, trying to make sense with the whole they there at the end, so you can ignore that. If you have the ESV, I think it's, but she will be preserved or saved. And I think that's better. That's more accurate. So, there are 3 questions to ask. If we're going to try to figure out what this means, there are 3 questions to ask. First, but woman, or we're going to say woman because they're wrong. But woman or she. Now, are we talking about all women here, because this is representative of all women. Is it Eve or is it Mary? Whoa, so that came out of left field, maybe even right field too. Mary. Okay, so there's that one. Are we talking about being saved as eternal, like spiritual salvation, or physical salvation? And then what are we talking about with childbearing? Are we talking about birth, raising the child, or just women's roles in general? Now, we can quickly talk about the whole physical or spiritual salvation, and this is going to eliminate a lot of options here. Paul never uses the word save, which is what we got here, preserve, save, in a way that refers to anything other than spiritual salvation. Never does he do that. And because of that, and then a huge hole in the logic that comes with the interpretation that this is a physical saving here during childbirth, we can get rid of the view that God physically saves the faithful in childbirth. Okay, so let's get rid of that one. Other viable options. You can be saved, I'd say viable, these at least make a little bit of sense, and then we're going to address them. Saved spiritually by having kids. Saved spiritually through proper female roles. Or it could be saved spiritually through Jesus. And there are several others, but these are the ones that at least somewhat make sense, and we'll talk about, anyways, we'll get there. So stay with me. Saved spiritually by having kids. All right, let's talk about that one. Grammatically, this is mostly possible. Theologically, this contradicts a lot of what Paul has already talked about in regard to salvation. It would be a completely new teaching. He's very much gone in detail about how to be saved, and nowhere else is it, oh, but by the way, women, you should have kids. In fact, he actually says in 1 Corinthians 7, if you can remain single and focus on the kingdom, that's even better. Okay, so we're not talking about women can only go to heaven if they have a child. All right, so let's get that one out of here. Number 2, saved spiritually through proper female roles. Now, this is a more viable option. Paul would be saying that this is not through active teaching and having authority in the church. That's not how women are saved, but being faithful to her role that is exemplified in being a mother, a role that only a woman can have. And so the woman will be honoring God by fulfilling her God-given role. And there's some pros to this. It makes sense with the whole saved. It's a spiritual sense. It kind of fits the context of verses 9 through 14, talking about the role of women. It's consistent with how Paul has talked about women in their roles in 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, and talks about they need to be devoted to their children, their homes, like 1 Timothy 5, 10, and 14. And also we have some false teachers teaching you should abstain from marriage, and so this kind of combats that teaching too, and that's 1 Timothy 4, verse 3. But there are some big weaknesses. So does this verse just imply that the proper role of women is to have children, which is their ultimate kind of avenue to salvation? No. And some think that childbearing is essentially just a stand-in for women fulfilling her role, but Paul doesn't really do that anywhere else. And so it would be kind of like it wouldn't really fit as well. There's also a contradiction in what I just said. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul says, if you can find contentment in being single, and instead of the distraction of marriage and family, you can focus on the kingdom, that's even better. So Paul would be kind of contradicting his own teaching a little bit, right? And so this is a possible view, but I think that there might be a better one. And I think it's saved spiritually through the Messiah. Now, if you're like me, you immediately think, well, that seems like a weird one because it's a little bit out of context. And I actually think there's some validity to this one that's pretty convincing. 1, Eve brought sin into the world by being deceived, verse 14. And then after this, God promises that her offspring shall bruise Satan's head. You remember that in Genesis chapter 3? A promise of the Messiah to come. Paul considers Eve a transgressor. She's been deceived and now she is into transgression. So it shows us Paul's thinking about Eve's spiritual state. She brought sin into the world and now she is in transgression. And so this is why he might connect the thought of Eve bringing sin into the world with the gospel, where Jesus brings salvation. In which case, when you're reading the text, the she at the beginning, the woman being saved through childbearing, is Eve. And then it says, and they will be saved, or if they practice, faith and love and holiness with self-restraint or self-control. The they there it could be all women, or it could be like Adam and Eve, representative of all humanity, but I think he's talking about all women here. So women are saved through Jesus. Whoa. What a new teaching, right? No, not really. And so either option requires women and to live in faith and love and holiness with self-control, if you're reading from the ESV, to experience salvation from the child who's born. There's a lot of evidence from that. I think the three best is, when you open a sentence and you see the word she, you're going to go straight back. The she looks like it's Eve, okay? This would connect the thoughts from verses 13 and 14 to verse 15, if we're talking about Eve here. And then also, Paul's obviously thinking about Genesis 2 and 3. We're talking about creation here, in which God promises the Messiah. So, there's a lot of other evidence for that. I skipped probably 8 or 9 things of evidence because time. Application of the verse, women are saved just as men are through Christ, but their roles are different. And so really, what we're talking about is not a putting women down. Women can't teach. What we're talking about is this is women's role. By the way, verse 8, men, you need to pray this way. Women, you need to be modest in your clothing, and you don't need to be teaching or having authority. And he grounds it in creation and says, but we're all saved the same. Keep in mind, this is the same Jesus, if we're talking about this Jesus here, who is the Jesus in verses 3 and 4, and 4 through 6, I think. That is the Jesus who is the mediator for all, right? So it really could be connecting that thought here. Here's the conclusion. That was a lot to cover. We just covered, and it was real fast, and I have probably 4 or 5 more pages of notes somewhere in what we just talked about. So let's lay it out real clear. Paul is speaking in the context of worship, verses 8 and then 9 and 10, and now here. Women should be learning just as men should be learning, but they are to be on the receiving end of the teaching, placing themselves in submission to the male teacher as God has designed it. Because Adam and Eve, he grounds it in creation. And then through Eve, and this is the interpretation here, through Eve, Jesus will come. And Jesus will save all women who practice faith and love and holiness and self-control. Women will be saved just as men are, placing all of God's children on the same level of fellowship because we were all saved by the same blood. Now, I know that was a lot. If you have any questions, if you want these notes, I put some more sources on the bottom of my notes just in case you do want them.